Good morning to all. I'm Carlos Braga, visiting professor of IMD and the expedition leader. It's always a pleasure to be in Rio, particularly when the weather is like today. These chairs, of course, were arranged for us because Winston asked for them and also for a glass of whiskey. We will have this at the right time. One small detail, this seminar is being streamed on Facebook, so I will control all my jokes, and just so that you'll be aware that this is being recorded, okay? It's a pleasure again to be in Rio in partnership with CEBRI. Every year when we come here, we organize a half day with CEBRI to discuss Brazil's international relations. I was explaining to our guests that the EMBA program at IMD, of course, has a group of very experienced executives, I like them, that typically go on discovery expeditions around the world, and one of them is to Brazil. So I explained that you have been to São Paulo, São José dos Campos, and now Rio, and that you are working hard on a series of Brazilian and multinational companies about strategy games that we'll be playing on Saturday. So, I'm not going to introduce all the speakers because we would take the whole morning just going through their curriculum. Two very old good friends and a new acquaintance, Embaixador José, Alfredo, Graça, Lima, Marcella Campos, and Winston Fritsch. Okay? You can read their resumes in your handbook. What I'm gonna do is just to put in context a few issues that will be the point of departure for our discussions. I'm a big fan of a Harvard psychologist called George Miller, who in the 1950s published a paper that is probably the best known paper in psychology. It's called 7 plus or less 2, the magic number. And this paper is about our short-term memory. Typically, we are able to maintain in our short-term memory up to 5 chunks of information, up to 9 chunks of information. But the average person, 7 chunks of information. If you are very clever like Embaixador Graça Lima, up to 9. If you are like me, just 5. So I'm gonna make just 5 points, okay? And these 5 points are first, a piece of bad news, the world economy is decelerating. Then I'm gonna talk very briefly about the shifting power in the global economy and what does it mean for a country like Brazil. Inevitably, when we talk about this, the third point, I will be very quick. I'll talk a little bit about China. And then I'll pose some questions to our guests in terms of what we should expect in the context of the Brazilian trade and foreign affairs, external relations policies for the coming years. So we'll end with the last discussion of what next. So, very quickly in terms of what is going on with the world economy. It's interesting to notice that by yearly 2008, all 40 largest economies in the world were growing. So there was nobody in recession. There was significant optimism about the prospects for the world economy. For the first time after the global financial crisis, most people believed that we were going to have a very dynamic situation at world level. Since then, we have had some major changes. Actually, by now, 70% of the world GDP has slowed down. So if you look at the economies around the world, there is nothing dramatic, with the exception, of course, of our friends in Argentina, Turkey, and Italy, okay? But China has decelerated. The US is decelerating, although it's still at a very good pace in terms of industrialized countries. Brazil actually is an exception, right? But this is simply because we couldn't do much worse. After the recession, 1.1% growth over the last 2 years, but now the expectation for this year, if you believe in the IMF, is going to be something like 2.1%. I always like to quote John Kenneth Galbraith, a Canadian economist, professor at Harvard, who used to say that economists only do economic forecasting to give credibility to astrology. But of course, let's believe in the numbers for a moment. So there is this situation, and the risks that we have ahead, of course, are very much associated to trade policy, one of the topics that we'll be discussing. What is happening in Europe, as I already mentioned, Italy is already in a recession, but let's also see what happens with Brexit. Market sentiment is changing, but the good news, particularly for Brazil, is that monetary authorities around the world seem to have decided to take a more accommodating policy. So the Fed, the American Central Bank, that was planning, at least that was the expectation, to have 2 additional increases in interest rates, in the policy interest rates of the United States this year. Now, if you believe what we have seen in the latest meetings of the Fed, most likely there will be no increase in interest rates. The European Central Bank is also taking a much more dovish tone with respect to monetary policy. This is important for emerging economies and particularly for Brazil in terms of capital flows. But there are risks, and of course Brexit is the great unknown, although as you probably have seen, yesterday we had good news. Well, it all depends on how interpreted. A few more months in this soap opera. Everybody thought that only Brazilians and Mexicans were good at doing soap operas, but the British are surpassing us with Brexit. So that's point number 1. The world economy is decelerating. Point number 2 is that we are in this moment of significant shifts in global political and economic power, right? I always like to mention, you have heard me saying this before, but if we think about China, for instance, one figure that jumps to us is the fact that between 2011 and 2013, China consumed more cement than the United States in the whole of the 20th century. Of course, this is not sustainable, but it gives you an idea of how things have been changing. And in terms of the trade space, so to say, we have been going through some dramatic shifts in the last 20 years or so. Around 1994, lots of optimism. All together now, creation of the WTO. I was at that time a trade economist with the World Bank. I wrote a few books saying that the best was still to come. I was totally wrong. We then had the start of the Doha Development Agenda, the Doha Round in 2001, but by 2008, basically the negotiations had come to an impasse. And the bottom line is the Doha Round is dead. Nobody is ready to say this. Well, the US has already said this, and some industrialized countries. But in theory, it is still going on, but there is no hope that it will be concluded, at least along the lines of the original plan, okay? I always remember I have been to most WTO ministerials. Then I had already retired from the World Bank. I was a professor at IMD, and I organized an event in Bali during the WTO ministerial of 2013. when we had a major development, which was the trade facilitation agreement. So my colleagues in the WTO, and I have many friends in the WTO, were very happy because this was a demonstration of progress. And I said, yes, it is a demonstration of progress, but it's a little bit like what I would like to see when I die and Winston comes to say an eulogy to me and I'm in a casket. What I would like him to say is, look, he's moving, right? So there is some movement, but this is in some very specific areas and not much has happened since then. We have then a tendency for formation of the so-called coalition of the willing, an explosion of regional trade agreements around the world, and particularly an attempt to create some mega regionals, like, for instance, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Unfortunately, with the new administration in the US, this, in the case of TPP, the United States withdrew from the agreement. In the case of TTIP, I would say that is a stillborn agreement because there is no political will from the side of the United States. So now we are in an era of unilateral actions, and that's one question that we'll be discussing here, because to a certain extent, a liberal multilateral regime can only survive if the strongest economic nation in the world is supporting this type of regime. And right now, the United States, no doubt, through its actions, is really putting in danger the multilateral system and a liberal trade regime around the world. So, going to China, I already mentioned some numbers about China. I just want to say that for Brazil, China has become extremely important, and this happened over the last 2 decades, from less than 2% of our exports. Nowadays, more than 20% are going to China. China has also become an important partner for investments, and no doubt there are many implications for Brazil, particularly with respect to our bottlenecks in infrastructure in terms of potential partnerships with China. So, what is happening in Brazil? So that's the topic of today. Brazil under new management. We have a new government, and we have a very new attitude in Itamaraty, our Foreign Affairs Ministry. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to ask my colleagues here to explain to you what is going on. But definitely there is some positive developments, like for instance, and this comes more from the Ministry of Economy, but definitely is also at least paid lip service by Foreign Affairs, an idea that it's time for Brazil to do a significant trade liberalization. And this, no doubt, is a very important part of the structural reforms that Brazil needs. Although I always like to say that it's not a silver bullet. I have written in favor of trade liberalization. Winston Fritsch was not even in high school, so I'm much older than him. So, and yet, we have to be careful in an economy with so many distortions like the Brazilian economy on how we implement it. Because the best example is, for instance, if you compare Brazil and Mexico. Mexico, quote unquote, embraced trade liberalization. I also teach at El Colegio de México, where I teach this course about trade liberalization, which is a course that I also teach at IMD for trade negotiators. And if you look what happened with productivity in Mexico, so Mexico as a counterfactor to Brazil, because particularly after '94 with NAFTA, Mexico liberalized significantly its trade schools, its trade policy. and Brazil still maintains a relatively protectionist attitude. But if you look at productivity in both economies, both countries haven't seen much of an impact in productivity. Actually, total factor productivity over the last 20 years or so for both economies has been negative. Okay? Now, of course, there are segments in the economies, agribusiness in Brazil, for instance, the oil sector, to a certain extent, where you have had significant progress in productivity in Brazil. But for the economy as a whole, I like to mention Mexico because here is a country that adopted much more liberal policies with respect to trade, and yet we haven't seen a dramatic increase in productivity. This does not mean that we should not liberalize. No, this would be the wrong, let's say, interpretation of what I'm saying. I'm just saying that if you don't also do tax reform, if you don't also do the measures to deregulate the economy and to create incentives for formality in the economy, the results are going to be much less significant than otherwise you would expect. So it's a much broader agenda, a difficult agenda. And this takes me to my last point. What should we expect from this new administration? We do have some interesting insights about Brazil now going for participation at OECD, so the membership of Brazil at OECD is being discussed. I'm sure Ambassador Graça Lima will say something about this. I used to be the director for Europe of the World Bank and was based in Paris, and I followed the initial conversations about Brazil, as many other countries, Colombia, with respect to OECD. It's a long road. It will depend a lot of green light from other partners, particularly the United States, and this administration seemed to be very much interested in pursuing an alignment with the United States and more specifically with the Trump administration. So all of these are quote-unquote good news in terms of the potential OECD membership for Brazil, but make no mistake, this will take some time. And on the other hand, there are some traditions in Brazilian foreign affairs, like, for instance, non-intervention, neutrality, and reciprocity, and emphasis on multilateral bodies that are very much now being put in question. So what all of this mean, I have no clue, but our guests have all the answers. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos. It's a privilege to be here with such good friends, as you said, Winston and Marcella. I'm sorry.
Stu, yeah. Okay.
Are here with us. Perhaps not to give a straight answer to your questions, but to reflect a little bit upon what we see and what we can foresee. Of course, no one has crystal balls, and from what we have witnessed after 100 days in office is perhaps a preparation for what is to come. But I'm going to start by saying, or by quoting rather, Thomas Jefferson in his definition of foreign policy. Not actually a definition, more an advice. When he says that, or he speaks about as an agenda for the United States, recently become independent. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. It looks a little bit like isolationist if you look at the second part of the sentence, but if you look at the first part, and take a country like, of course, the United States has, after so many years, became a world power, hegemony, and therefore became more distant from this advice by Jefferson. But considering that they took, I don't know, more than a century for the United States even to have a free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, it says a lot. This says a lot about not entangling alliances, even if we're speaking about trade alliances, which is very important because commerce is precisely the second point that Jefferson makes. In the case of Brazil, peace is assured by the fact that we have no quarrels with our 10 neighbors. And this has been established by the efforts of Baron Branco and our, let me say, with no false modesty, efficient diplomacy along the years. Diplomacy that was always turned not to the interests of the country, not to because interests may not be entirely legitimate, and interests may turn into conflicts, even if they are legitimate. But the needs are important, and commerce is a need. Trade is a need. You can only attend to your needs by the application of the principle of comparative advantage. And Brazil has absolute advantages in many products and in a few services, and it's a major recipient of investments because it's so rich, because it's so endowed with natural resources. This is the central point that one has to make every time that there's an attempt to explain foreign policy, regardless of what you hear, regardless of the statements of the propositions that you see or hear. The country has needs. The foreign policy is a continuum. It is a process that had its start when Brazil was still a colony, but has to do precisely what the country actually is. That's why geography plays such an important role whenever you speak about foreign policy. Jefferson omits the geographical, let's say, element, but geography, human geography, economic geography in Brazil shapes its foreign policy. It has been done for years and years. So, and of course, the geography is crucial to the objective of peace, because you have to formulate and implement foreign policy having regard principally to your neighbors. South America, therefore, should be, we never know whether it is or not, because again, there's the rhetorics and there's the action itself. But you cannot, of course, disregard the fact that our neighbors, our circumstance is absolutely vital for the progress, for the attainment of the objectives of the country, which are very simply those that every responsible country has. Growth, social, economic development, a better income and wealth distribution, and precisely in the case of Brazil and right now, with reduction of costs. So and then you have South America, and you have within South America Mercosur, which is subject today to some sort of debate whether it's worth it or not. Mercosur is a reality. Winston Fritsch is a professor of Mercosur. He was one of the creators of this success story, which Mercosur is in political terms. The fact that Argentina and Brazil were able to get together and bury the dreams or the hallucinations of building an atomic bomb was the start of this friendship. It has been preserved in spite of all the trade disputes that have along the year. I say that, and I repeat that the Mercosur is a political success story because it was even able to overcome the difficulties brought by, you know, at that time brought by the inclusion of Venezuela and the exit of Paraguay. A little mess that occurred, and which is now very behind us, and luckily. So when Minister Paulo Guedes said in November that Mercosur was not a priority, he was looking at one episode in Mercosur history, which has little to do with its success in political terms. In terms of integration, which was what Mercosur should be about, much has to be done. It is still an imperfect union and customs union, and it's also an incomplete free trade area. But this has a future. We have today the perspective of revising the common external tariff and go ahead with Argentina in search of a Mercosur, which is what it was supposed to become. An example of open regionalism. Because what the Minister of Economy says is what the foreign policy would aim to be, which is which is a plan to reduce tariffs and engage into autonomous liberalization. The only way or the only solution for the productivity problems which you have pointed out, Carlos, and the recovery of a manufacturing industry which has the productivity of which has been declining over the years. So first Mercosur, South America, as from Mercosur. And second, of course, if you look at the second element in Jefferson's definition, China. You have talked about it. I'm not gonna waste time speaking about the importance of China for us, and therefore for our external policy. So I'm sorry. And when they ask me how Brazil should deal with this these trade tensions especially between the United States and China. This is a typical problem to be dealt with within WTO. That's where we have to talk about China, because everyone would benefit from China also, in spite of its tremendous contribution to world welfare, controlling of inflation and other benefits as well. The economic model of China has, of course, its impacts in terms of overproduction and, of course, prices that go down because of enormous stocks that have been built. Some discipline is, of course, necessary, not only for China, for everyone, but particularly for one country that has. I'm not talking about this specific conflict on technology that has triggered perhaps the dispute between United States and China. But I clearly see that there should be benefits from everyone from the opening of markets worldwide. This takes me to I'm gonna have maybe minutes 5. So let me speed up a little bit and speak more generally about. I already made the point about Brazilian needs and objectives, and I'd say, well, I have a number. I'm just gonna read the list of according to this criteria by Jefferson. The priorities that should be in the minds of those that formulate and implement the foreign policy. I said that I talked about the Southern Cone, Mercosur, and South America. And the second, agriculture. Brazil, well, there's this whole debate about special and differential treatment should not be applied to Brazil. After all, a country that wants to accede to the OECD, it would be ridiculous to be treated or to apply for any kind of benefits, which are dubious, to say the least, that come from a special and differential treatment. What Brazil should look for is more the strengthening of multilateralism, not the multilateral system that has practically collapsed after the Doha round failed, and also the Trump administration started to question the efficiency of the dispute settlement system in the WTO. But there is one thing that you did not mention, Carlos, and the G20 decided that the WTO members should focus on reform of the WTO, and much good can come from there. When the Uruguay round was successfully concluded, it was not expected to have another round. We just negotiate agriculture and services and whatever. Compras gubernamentais, government procurement and things like that, proceeding by sectors, just like it was done in Bali, with progress in agricultural subsidies later on in Nairobi. So we're making progress little by little. But even before China, I would list as a priority the United States and the new NAFTA, the U.S. MCA, and I'm not saying that this it's been treated as an alignment, but you know, this visit, this presidential visit to the United States is perhaps a very interesting starting point for particularly in what was achieved in terms of you know, not only the OECD, but the prospect of reducing the tensions, if there are any. I mean, United States is a country that imports more industrial goods from Brazil, today even more than Argentina, and this is complementarity, and this is extremely important in terms of satisfying the needs on both sides. Then you have European Union. I'm not a believer in this Mercosur European Union agreement. We can talk about that later, but I can find one single reason for having this agreement now. And still, what you see is, and what you hear is, you know, that this is one agreement that is going to be pursued. And finally, after Africa and Middle East, Jefferson also did not mention history and culture and tradition, but this is important as a third priority. And that's when Africa and the Middle East come. Middle East more because of trade, but Africa absolutely because of culture and history. And finally, OECD, which I consider as the most important challenge in terms of trade policy and therefore foreign policy that we have. I don't know, and I stop it. And I stop it. That look forward to the debate, and we should and try to clarify some points which were, you know, which were mentioned here and could be explored a little further.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Definitely we will come debate. I'm sure that our interventions are going to diminish in time because these chairs are very uncomfortable. But Marcella, I understand you have a PowerPoint, so probably we have to change. Yeah.
It is.
Very good.
Okay, so thank you for. Sorry, here we are. Can you hear me? First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with you guys and with the distinguished finalists. Before we start, I did prepare a presentation for you, and although I used some slides from Petrobras and from INT, I don't speak on behalf of Petrobras. So this is the first disclaimer that I speak for myself, and I do not necessarily represent what Petrobras thinks about all those topics that I will mention. So let's now, in my turn, try to talk about some international relations that happen beyond governments, which is between multinational companies. In the end, international relations is what happens between societies, and governments represent them, but it's in the end the relations that people and companies have between themselves. And of course, with the globalization and the consequent reduction on transport costs, oil has become a commodity, and the oil and gas sector is truly a global business. So it's a privilege to talk about the topic. And I have here we go. I have divided my presentation in 3 topics. Let's just talk a little bit about the energy complex market before we start narrowing down to Brazil oil and gas market, and then Petrobras recovery and what we do in this market. To start with, coming from an European business school, I'm aware that you are all very conscious about the dynamics in the oil and gas market. Where you will have the concern and the major dynamics, the concern about sustainability, access, and safety. On the one hand, we do have all those the emissions being in the top agenda of many countries, especially in Europe. The emissions of the CO2 and the consequent agreements on the international level to mitigate climate change. And even though we have the Trump administration trying to meet the Paris Agreement, we do have this and we do see, and Petrobras is also the climate change mitigation and the effort to produce and to clean up energy matrix as a tendency in the world. We do have the renewables generating double of energy for the last years compared to previous years. We do have a technological revolution that is electrifying the matrix, and this changes the demand for oil. But on the other hand, so this all affect the demand side, but on the other hand, in the supply side, we still need to include about 1 billion people that in the world don't have access to energy. And there, in the supply side, about 42% of the production today are in countries that are in geopolitical conflict possibilities. I use here the data from the World Energy Outlook of the International Agency to say that renewables are growing faster than any other source of energy in the world, during the current policy scenarios, new policy scenario, sustainable development scenarios. But still, and among fossil fuels, natural gas grow faster than any other. That's a hot topic in Brazil now. But still, oil remains an important energy source in the world and in the Brazilian matrix. So although all the trend that we see of the growing perspectives for renewables, oil will remain in the base of the oil matrix in every scenario of the agents, of Petrobras, of everything, anywhere. So in absolute terms, oil will still be an important source of energy. And we still don't know yet which source will replace the oil and gas in the future, in terms of the size of the business and also the safety that it offers to the electrical, to the system in general. So I'll just narrow down now to the Brazil oil and gas market. Obviously, you probably have heard that Brazil has a huge potential in wind and solar. I'm not going to talk about it. It's very interesting to see. It's still an industry to develop in Brazil. Has been growing very, very fast in the last years. But as we will just now talk about the oil and gas sector that has also huge potential. I took this from ANP, which is our regulator of the oil and gas market, oil and gas industry in Brazil. You probably have heard about pre-salt. Pre-salt is an accumulation of oil that in Brazil, in the coast of Brazil, we have under the layer of salt, and it's been discovered about 12 years ago, 2006 to be precise. And Petrobras has been producing oil from the pre-salt for the last 10 years. We have already produced 2 billion barrels of oil from the pre-salt, and it's a very competitive protein chain oil market, and I will explain you why. This this map is just to show you that this is on the news all the time, and even in international paper you see about pre-salt. But it's still only less than 4% of sedimentary bases area of Brazil are under possession, which means that we have a huge potential here. We'll talk about it, but it's possible that we have oil from other parts of the world. Recently, there has been a discovery in Guyana, which is a neighbor country of Brazil, made by Exxon, and it might be that there is an accumulation of oil like we found in pre-salt also in the northeast of the country. So investors are looking. Talking about productivity of pre-salt, just to have an idea, from our fields onshore and also in the conventional offshore, you produce 16 hours. Company produced 16 barrels per day. In the conventional offshore, 650 barrels per day. But in the pre-salt, you can produce up to even more, 17,655 barrels per day. This is a chart that I like very much. It's just to interpret that with you is the production of oil nowadays. The most part of it it's done by taking a very low break-even cost. And Petrobras has a big, relatively important accumulation that can be explored in a very low break-even. So when I mentioned previously, I talked that there will still be a demand for oil in the short and in the long run. This means combining that with this information. This means that pre-salt and Brazil, and also those oil provinces that has lower break-even are the more attractive to investment in the future. So the government has understand this, and even though we had some interruption of the bidding rounds for some years in Brazil, since 2006 there has been a review of the regulatory framework where adjustment to the local content have been made. Local content requirement was very huge and very imperative for the development of the industry in Brazil. And we can talk about that later in the Q&A session. And the government has understood that it has to be more predictable with the bidding route in order for investors to qualify and to come. There have been a new renewal of the tax incentives, and also the elimination of pre-salt obligation to be the sole operator in the pre-salt area that I showed you before. That resulted in a huge interest in Brazil from the foreign companies. There have been about 30 participating companies in the last 2 years bidding rounds that brought about 30 billion in bonds, in reais bonds. It was very successful in the world of oil and gas market. And there are still more to come. This is a chart that shows the market structure, as we say. In the exploration productivity, there are many companies now in Brazil. In the distribution, this has always been a market open to competition, but in the refining sector, Brazil Petrobras is still very dominant in the market. So Petrobras now having its divestment problem and the intention to divest from lots of refineries to bring competition to the country. And also in the gas market, there will be opportunity. And that probably will increase Brazil's participation in the global and trade flows. Here I brought some information about the ANP at Petrobras. The oil balance is we are net export of crude, and we are importer of oil products, like in diesel or gasoline. But just to talk about participation, we produce on average in Brazil 3.3 millions of barrels per day. That represents a little bit more than 3% of the world production. You can say that it's still very little, but it can increase a lot with all the investments that will come to Petrobras and the production curve that will increase in the next years. And this is just an information about how FDI has been entering the country, specific in the oil and gas sector. And then I go to Petrobras, which is the national oil company in Brazil. It's the traditional company that has been playing in every stage of the value chain of the oil and gas in the country. That's big numbers. Petrobras at a glance, we produce 2.6 million barrels per day. The other number that I said, about 3, is the production in Brazil. The whole country of other companies too. Petrobras produces 2.6. We refine about 2.2. That's equivalent of the size of the market. There's a huge transportation of pipelines and vessel fleet and terminals. In the gas and power sector, Petrobras is very dominant, and there is still participation in the distribution and retail. We are in other countries in Latin America, and we are leaving Nigeria now. And it's the intention of Petrobras to focus on the pre-salt, so we are divesting from fields and from operations abroad. What we have achieved with this focusing on our best assets and assets that we are best owners, is that we have had a huge success with the divestment program, and we have been able to reduce our debt. And our net debt to EBITDA went from 5.1, huge in the oil and gas sector, to 2.3 in 3 years. The net debt to EBITDA went from $106 billion to 69. It's one business case of recovery and turnaround was made in very few years. And the divestment program, as I mentioned, it was a huge contributor to the success. It's already 15.2 billion accumulated in divestments, and especially from companies or activities that we are not the best owners or the best owners of those assets. So we made those divestments also through strategic partnerships that we made with foreign companies. And strategic partnerships, in our definition, there is that we do change. It can be assets, or it can also be technology and knowledge of how to operate in this pre-salt, even though that Petrobras is here and has developed the technology to operate in the pre-salt, that foreign companies are very interested to partner with us. But on the other hand, we take from them their expertise on operating in solar plants, offshore wind, which is, for example, in Equinor, a big thing. So those strategic partnerships are a two-hand relationship, very interesting for Petrobras and for the country, because we can potentialize the exploration in the oil, but also we can develop other sources of energy in the country. Those are, I can just read the slides for you later, you don't need to read them. Those are the themes or in areas that we cooperate with other foreign companies. And Petrobras, as I mentioned, has a very unique position in the pre-salt. It was discovered by Petrobras, and we have developed the technology to operate over this production, the investment in deep water, 20 in the whole world in projects, about 23% is made by Petrobras. We have been able, participating in those bidding rounds that I mentioned before, we have been able to replace our reserves, and we are, it's been very important that the bidding rounds happened in the last years for the Petrobras and other oil companies to replace its reserves. And here is I just bring some numbers about the current strategic plan and how we focus our investments. And in terms of CapEx, still 68 billion is directed to the exploration of oil and gas from the pre-salt specifically. But this, we call it the driving force, but it has this investment and the return that we have from it, it's been paving the way for Petrobras to move toward the future and invest in natural gas or wind, solar, and biofuels. We still invest very little on that, but we do invest in research and development and we try to capture, especially through partnerships, what is the potential in solar and wind in Brazil in the future. There are some examples of renewable energy projects here that we can talk later. We have now some targets in terms of intensity of CO2 in the exploration and production, but also in the refining. And just to finalize, these are the new 5 pillars to follow in the current management. Optimize capital allocation, improve ROCE and reduce cost of capital, focus on low cost, reinforce meritocracy and respect to life, environment and safety. With this, I end my presentation. Thank you for being here, and we can discuss further
Sure.
the Q&A.
Winston, your turn.
You can ask my physiotherapist to send the bill to the MD.
Now we'll send to the hotel.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think not to disappoint you. It's very important to tell you 2 things. One, you may know, this government is new. It's 100 days today. Coincidence, I think you timed that.
Oh, definitely.
And the second is that changing foreign economic policy in Brazil is not an easy thing. Not at all. For at least 3 reasons. First, history and geography. I mean, the way the country is, or any country, is integrated into the flows of trade and investment and war depends on history and geography. And the fact that Brazil is multilateral by nature. I mean, we have a totally diversified pattern of trade and even investment. Trade is even more concentrated in the flow of trade, usually more diversified than the flow of investment. And we have a finger in every pie. That's why, I'll come to that later, Brazil is traditionally a multilateralist. That's good for us. Besides, we're not big militarily, etc. And we were present at the creation of the post-war multilateral world. For many, many reasons, Brazil has this multilateral vocation. So trying to change that into a kind of bilateral deals can be even dangerous. I mean, if you pick, for instance, as the government announced, special relations like the US or Israel, we'll have problems with China, it's a huge trade partner, or with Arab countries, which are important trade partners. So this is not an easy thing. It's easily said and done. I'll come to that. There's a conspiracy theory about globalism, etc., which I don't understand. And that will make very difficult to abandon or not give prestige to multilateral institutions. It's actually contradictory to this new falling in love with the OECD. So there's a lot of contradictions there. But it's difficult to change the position of Brazil in the system. Because you also have to change the second thing, which makes changing foreign economic policy in Brazil difficult, which is tradition. I mean, we have a public service in the foreign office in Brazil, which is different from many, many countries. And this guy, my friend here, has a career, you know, they're all of them. They enter the service when they are at university level. I mean, they have to have a university diploma to go into the school, the foreign office school, which is where they graduate to become a career, like a military. They get promotion, etc. So they have an established culture. You don't change culture by speech. You have to have a lot of speech and a lot of rhetoric. And a very special situation to change that. Well, it's nothing of that. And so, what's being said by the young foreign minister may not be something easy to change or make, to herd the cats of the Foreign Office is difficult. Herding cats is difficult. They're all very bright, all have their own ideas, so it's going to be difficult. Last but not least, foreign economic policy is foreign economic policy. It's not economic policy. And when you put this adjective, you make it a kind of second level policy. You cannot do foreign economic policy without how the country is moving in terms of economics. You cannot do trade liberalization in the middle of a recession. You can, but I bet you won't be successful. It's much easier to adjust when you're growing. And you need adjustment to trade liberalization. And also, it's a subsidiary policy to main tenets of economic policy in a country which is in the deep throes of a recession, which is fiscally led. The government's prioritizing other issues in economic policy. So trade liberalization, although was at the beginning the discourse of the Minister of Finance, it still seriously is, the guy's a liberal, no doubt about that. I don't think they'll put it on the forefront of policies for the time being. So all this thing about getting out of Mercosur or going, liberalizing trade unilaterally, I think we have to wait a little bit, and we'll come to that in a minute. So I'll pick some of these announced points and make at the end a projection how this wild statements will eventually land in a more realistic fashion. So what was announced? I mean, there's, I think, two visions. The foreign minister vision, the foreign ministry vision, and the economics ministry vision. The first one is based on this more of a conspiracy theory about the globalism. So let's go for back to nation state. I mean, you heard that in the United States. It's Trumpism South, more or less, which I don't think will fly. And the complement of that criticism of multilateralism, which is a deification of the role of the nation states in bilateral proactivism in foreign relations. This is one line, that's the foreign ministry line. Difficult to make into policy, but that's how it is. And the second is the Minister of Economy, which is the old and good liberalism, trade liberalism, and also a certain bad will against the Mercosur of the PT. I'll explain that. Mercosur was created in the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. It was a liberal government. The idea was to liberalize trade. All the other parties have a trade regime which was far more protectionist than Brazil. So going into that association meant lowering tariffs in Brazil. Brazil had already started in the previous government, if I have to be make justice with the previous government, with an unilateral liberalism commercial policy. And that was good. And then the Mercosur was a consolidation of this ongoing liberalization in Brazil. And that was it. It was a customs union. It was more or less molded on the European community, the European Union concept. That was complicated in the end. It was very difficult to finalize a full single tariff, but in the end it was an almost full single tariff with a program to make them make this whole thing a single tariff in a series of years. When the PT came into government, this thing was transformed into a chaotic free trade zone, mostly by political alliances, by bringing in left-wing governments in Latin America, like Venezuela, Bolivia, etc. That distorted the whole thing. So the Mercosur was actually in need of a reform. But this idea of abandoning the Mercosur, which appeared at the beginning in the speech of the top-ranking official, the Minister of the Economy, was there. Let's reform the whole thing. Let's get out of it. We had a big discussion, CEBRI, a few months ago about what the hell is that? Are we leaving Mercosur or not? And obviously, it's very difficult to do that. But that was the idea. I mean, liberalize trade, get out of Mercosur, and go talking to people without paying attention to the multilateral institutions, which are a way of dominating. But there's a funny theory about the role of the architecture that was built after the Second World War. And what we see now, that first of all, trade liberalism passed to a second level. It appeared, and wisely so, because we are in a country that has what we call a coalition presidentialism. We have a presidential system, more than the US system, but we don't have a bipartisan system. We have a more of an Italian party system, 30 parties or 30-something parties. So you have to create a coalition that totally different. 30 parties, you have a lot of ideologies. And you have to amass political support for legislation in a very complicated system. So if you want to go for a reform, for instance, as we are, which is fundamental, which is the social security reform and fiscal reform, you cannot throw bullets at random and start trade reform, because you'll be shooting a lot of people that will need help. So if you are doing fiscal reform, you should do it first and then liberalize trade. Also, there's technical things. So a series of considerations by the economics ministry led to the conclusion that we should step down a little bit, put the foot on the brake on the trade policy, which is important, still there. We'll be liberalizing down the road. We'll be discussing the Mercosur, taking it to a much more liberal step down the road, but not right now. I really doubt that will occur, because we are focused on passing an extremely complicated fiscal reform and social security reform. So that was already put on the drawer. The so-called activist bilateralism was reduced to a previously planned trip to the US, to Israel, and Chile, which was nice. Nobody understood exactly what came out of it, except for China becoming extremely worried with the special relation with the United States in the middle of this mess between the US and China. And the Arabs didn't like any special relation with Israel, a state with which Brazil has enormous ties since the beginning. Brazil was the first vote on the formation of Israel. Brazil received Jewish population through the war was received here. They live here, low interest. I mean, we have an excellent relation with Israel. And we don't need to be any announcement of a special relation for a country that exports agricultural products to the tilt, to the Arabs. So this was also something that was done later, some protests, and nothing exactly important came out of it. Last but not least appeared this idea, this idée fixe, as the French say, with the entry in the OECD. Now, this is funny, because, I mean, it's good, but is it going to be transformation? First of all, it's a multilateral agency as well, so there are some multilaterals and other multilaterals, fine. This is the multilateral of the good guys, fine. Now, the argument is much more an argument from the Minister of the Economy, and I understand why, because they say, I don't buy this point, but the point is rational. They say, look, if you go to this kind of nice club, you have to wear a tie, you have to have proper shoes, you have to have good policies, because it's a club. So you go there, you get educated. Is Greece? Greece has been a member of the OECD since the beginning, and they did horrible things in terms of policy. So it's not something easy. It's not, a friend of mine said something, said, look, it looks like the father of the parents of a girl that can say no to the kids. And then they, instead of sending them to the psychoanalyst, they buy her a chastity belt, lock the key, and throw the key away. I mean, this is ridiculous, and it won't get better just because you're forbidden to do something. I mean, you get crazy, maybe, but it's not better. So this is something strange. And I feel that that's good, because, well, the cost is not huge in fiscal terms. You train your foreign officials, which is always good. The guys there, okay, the club is okay. The club is very good, technically. The palace in Paris, very nice. Not too much to change policies in Brazil, because you have something called the parliament here, much better educating these guys than getting your public officials into the OECD. But it's good. Create some disciplines, good long term, still step, it's nothing revolutionary. So this is what was the strange thing about modernism. Brazil has been always at the creation of the architecture of the post-war model. When Brazil was at the creation of the IMF, at the World Bank, UN, you name it. And with very prominent participation. President of the OEC, what's called president or director general. A leading participation in the COP21, the Paris climate change discussions, leading. Besides, these agreements were not possible without the participation of Brazil. So we've always been good guys. We like it. It's good for us. We're weak. We're not militarily strong at all. We have this huge coast to take care of. Not a big army, navy, or air force. So we are multilaterally diversified. We trade with everybody. So it's nice to have a police. The police is good for the poor, for the guys that don't have power. So this architecture is good for countries like Brazil. We don't have 1-2% of world trade, not big, but we're important in something. So we are a trading country since colonial times. So it's good to be to have rules for trade, etc. I don't understand why you can have a conspiracy theory about the OMC. I don't understand. I can say it's wrong, but I don't understand. It's like a foreign language. So I think that's sort of better out with time. Although this was announced with great fanfare at the beginning. And that's it. Now, also the Mercosur will wait. We'll come back to this issue, I think, later, but still on the agenda. And it's good, because Mercosur has deteriorated beyond the Commission in terms of institution. And now, the last but not least is this proactivism in bilateral directions. Not but Israel, Chile, etc. This is, but United States. What is being read as a policy of not subsidies, not subsidies. Subsidies is a too strong word. Alignment. Automatic alignment. Maybe that. A policy automatic alignment with the United States for Brazil is absolutely crazy, given China-US relations today and the role that China is playing increasingly in infrastructure, investment, financing in the third world. They are interested, obviously, they're not doing that because they are internationalists or they like the poor, because they developed that crazy development boom. Very important companies that understand about important aspects of technology, of infrastructure, etc. And they have free money to lend to the China Development Bank, to the Exim Bank, etc. So they created this Silk Trade Road, whatever it's called, initiative, which is it's Chinese. They plan ahead, they align people, they press the button, and they go. And they are lending money left and right, and that's important. If you have good projects, they don't say, do that project. They're like, no, they're passive. I know these guys, I talk to them, so I know what I'm talking about. If you have good projects, they finance. They don't finance anything. They have a rational criteria, but they are willing to do that. And they behave in a more friendly way than free markets. So you get development risk addressed. You have country risk in Brazil that sometimes you have to put a huge insurance or FX hedge, and then your rate of your cost of capital goes to the moon. Well, the Chinese, they're not crazy, but they have a different risk profile. That's very good. So that the way is crazy, given our needs of infrastructure. Now, the US today, and that's something people don't know, the Trump government approved, give me just a couple of minutes. The Trump government approved one initiative as a bipartisan initiative, which was amazingly impressive, which is something called the BUILD Act. It was approved late last year. They create something called United States International Development Finance Corporation with a budget of $60 billion. And the first page statement says that we're doing that because of the Chinese. We want to fight the Chinese on the investment finance ground. So it's a kind of investment dimension of the trade fight. Still a bit subdued, but it's already going on in Washington, a change of, they're getting the OPIC and the US states, merging them, creating this US International Finance Development Corporation with a huge bureaucracy. It starts in October. Done. approved by Congress, done, being executed. Now, if you align automatically this, I mean, you probably have to be serious about that. So, are you going to get money in China when they say we're doing something to fight the Chinese, etc.? So you end up tying your hands in a country like Brazil, which is capitalist without capital. I mean, the nice thing about Brazilian capitalism is that we don't have capitalism. But we want to be capitalists, so we have to get capital from abroad. We have to run a nice surplus and borrow. So it's much nicer to have competition, be friendly with both ends of the game, and actually talk to both, make competition, have the good projects, good progress we have. Brazil would be very attractive as compared to, especially today, Argentina, Turkey. Look at the other middle-income countries that can develop good projects today. I think Brazil is very, very high on that list. So it's crazy to automatically align with the United States, because we perceive something, tying your hands in all this discussion about investment with the Chinese. So I think all these announcements, going back to the beginning, they were done in a very emotional way. This government is not only new. This government outside economic policy, which in Brazil, thank God, since the Real Plan, we got some kind of, although the PT tried to change the paradigm, you saw the cost of changing the paradigm. So we're back to the old paradigm of flexible exchange rates, fiscal balance, etc. So we're trying to get back to the nice roots. In other policies, the government is shooting revolutionary things. I mean, in several areas of policy in Brazil, and one is climate change, by the way, which was outside my realm of competence, but I think, I'm afraid that on this one particular thing, Brazil may get out of tradition, but it's still to be seen. The Brazilian participation, Paris Agreement was adjourned, etc. But this is an area where I don't know what we're going to have. And if it's alignment in the United States, I still don't know what we're going to have. But, so this is a complicated area. But coming back, this government has very good economists, and the team is good. They know what they're going to do, but outside that, it's very complicated. And what worries me more is this changing tradition in the Itamaraty, in the house of our friend, Ambassador Graça, because these guys have been running the house with great competence for decades. So this is a big shift. I hope they don't do it badly. Thank you.
Very good. I know you must have many questions, but we are going to take a quick break for coffee, okay? 10 minutes coffee. I guess if I were to summarize what we have discussed, of course, with a very important sector like oil and gas and the actions of Petrobras and where it's going, it's more specific, and then many questions with respect to the external relations of Brazil. There are many, many questions. It depends a lot on the perspective of who is trying to answer these questions. If you are an economist, a foreign affairs expert, it reminds a little bit the story of when Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went camping. They go camping, they put the tent, go to sleep. In the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes wakes up Watson. Watson, do you see the sky? And Watson says, yes. What do you surmise from this? Well, there are billions of stars. There must be other solar systems out there. There may be life in the universe. And then Sherlock Holmes says, you stupid, somebody stole our tent. So it all depends on who you ask. Let's have coffee. Okay, if we could take our seats. We have a roving mic. And if you have questions, just raise your hand. If it is a generic question, we all answer. If it is a specific question, tell whom you would like to address, and please identify yourself if you are Brazilian, if you are somebody in the IMD group, where are you from, okay? Because today, as you probably saw in the news, Mr. Assange was thrown out of the embassy in Ecuador in London, and now we're gonna have some very interesting legal issues. So we have to be careful with what is leaked from our debates.
Yeah, right. Hello, my name is Amir Kourourian. Born in Iran. I'm Swiss by citizenship. I'm living in Switzerland for the past 20 years. I'm working for an investment company in cereals, and we're investing in West Africa and Africa in general. Thanks very much for the presentation. What I would like to hear a little bit more from your side, I mean, whoever, you were talking about China, and eventually, you know, probably noticing this diminishing power that, you know, from the east to west, moving a little bit again back to the cyclic approach of history to probably Asia. Now the question for a country like Brazil is that if they get involved with the projects and investment projects with Chinese, how would you be able, in practical terms, for a business perspective, how would you, what's the legal framework you should take into account in order to secure the contracts, in order that you can maintain a long-lasting relationship and establishing trust within the Chinese from a business perspective?
Okay. Winston will jump first if anybody wants to add later. Winston?
Let's separate the actors, okay? Sponsors, which are the equity providers, the Chinese, which are finance providers, usually co-finance providers, because maybe the Brazilian National Development Bank or the Brazilians may co-lend with them. Now the sponsors, they don't care if the sponsor is not Chinese. They like to push some sponsor into the thing, but they won't go without a local partner. From my perspective, I'm not talking from dealing with people. So having good projects, good sponsors, quality projects is essential. They're not throwing money at random, but they want to force exports of goods and services tied with the loans. Okay? So they know they have an advantage. And they're beginning to think, since the developing world doesn't have much capital, of even doing equity. They're creating a myriad of private equity funds, not private, but public equity funds, which is a typical Chinese thing, usually sponsored by the same big banks, like the Chinese Development Bank, to do the equity, help the locals with the equity portion. So we have local and foreign sponsors. For instance, a typical project would be a Brazilian and a French sponsors doing a water company. I'm just talking to my head. I'll give you an example. They present the project, the guys like, and the Brazilian Development Bank is even talking to them about co-financing. And they're thinking sometimes of, as they don't have the quality of capacity, technical capacity to analyze Brazilian projects as compared to the Brazilian Economic Development Bank, they are thinking even of financing the Brazilian Economic Development Bank so that they re-lend their money. So what they want is to make the project happen with an important Chinese component. Because after this infrastructure cycle, domestic demand is going to peter out, so investment in infrastructure is going to slow down, and they have these huge companies, which are quite competent, and builders today do very good things, especially in the sectors they want to promote things in sectors that they can efficiently export goods and services. So this is the story, more or less. It's not, I think it's a fantastic deal for a developing country. The idea that the Chinese will control everything. Well, if you have local sponsors, the equity, the owners of the thing, yeah, you're just financing things you don't do domestically. Because in Brazil we have some rules that, for instance, the BNDES, the National Economic Bank, the bank will only go into the financing if there is a domestic component. So I think the Chinese would be happy to have 20% domestic component. This is to be discussed, but you want to push this, the services and the building and the export of machinery. I mean, this is not something untied, it's tied. But with market-based groups,
Yeah, I mean,
that's my view.
I have one example from Petrobras during the crisis that we had the financial crisis of the firm where our debt was very high. We took a 5 billion loan with the China Development Bank and in Singapore. It was a big thing, very successful business. I mean, we are partners with China in many aspects. They build, currently building many of our FPSOs, which are platforms that operate offshore. They are interested in entering in pre-salt to also explore here, and this is why we are partnering with CNPC and CNOC. But in the financial domain, and the refineries, they are interested in entering the refining divestment program of Petrobras and in change of oil, because they have a huge expectation that the oil demand in China will increase, and Brazil will continue to be a net exporter of oil.
Just to complement it, this is the infrastructure greenfield finance. Okay, now buying Brazilian assets. Brazil
In
has
the electrical power that's in
yeah. But Brazil has the most liberal ever foreign direct investment policy. Brazil has always been very liberal in foreign direct investment since the post-war and very protectionist in trade. That's why I explained that everything is produced by multinationals. So you guys just jump the tariff barrier and produce it. So in foreign direct investment, this is another ballgame. That's a perception that Chinese are buying Brazil. That because the big state companies that are buying transmission lines, buying ready-made assets. It's nothing to do with the Silk Road initiative, nothing like that. This is the big state companies buying assets outside China. But infrastructure finance is more or less as we explained.
Is there any general acceptable legal framework that eventually the government in Brazil proposing the companies when they get into joint venture or M&A that they need to adhere to or accept to secure sort of a general policy?
They're not just talking about China, they're talking about in general.
In general,
Well, we have a competition policy, you cannot do an M&A without approval by the competition policy. If it's a regulated sector, the regulators buy an electricity company, you have to be approved, the new operator has to be approved by the regulator. I mean, but not much different from the OECD. You have to go, M&A is not just you come here and buy a lettuce. And depends on the sector, it gets a lot of approvals between signing and closing.
Thank you.
Okay, just a brief comment on China. Two things that Winston mentioned that are very important, and also the example that Marcella gave. China often engages in loans or in deals in exchange for natural resources. If you are a country that can negotiate this, or a company that can negotiate this, I would argue, typically are very good deals for both parties. If you are a country that cannot negotiate this properly, sometimes it can go very wrong, okay? As I mentioned to you, to the students before, I was the Director of Economic Policy and Debt of the World Bank. So I was responsible for HIPI, the heavily indebted poor countries debt relief program, together with the IMF. So when a country receives debt relief under HIPI, then to go into debt again, we'll have to get authorization from the IMF, the World Bank, and the donors that paid for the debt relief to avoid 1 year later the country coming back to ask for more debt relief. I remember well one case of the Democratic Republic of Congo that China was offering a very interesting loan for them, but in exchange for mineral resources that if you were to make the calculations, you could put some doubts into the quality of the loan. In the end, they had to change with advice from my team, okay? So these are case-by-case situations. But as was pointed out, China has a strong interest also in exporting services, be it skilled labor, be it complementary services to the investments. In a country like Brazil, for you to bring labor, for instance, in the country, is a little bit complicated. Okay? In other countries, particularly in Africa, this has been happening in a significant way. But there are many deals that can be done in a significant way with a country like China at this point in time, exactly because they have financial capacity. They do have also excess capacity in areas like steel, cement, etc., that they are in a very pragmatic manner exporting through the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. Okay. We have a question via Facebook, so before we come back here, so this is from Guilherme Tudio. I have a question regarding Brazil-Africa relations. One of the cornerstones of the previous administrations in terms of foreign policy was South-South cooperation and an increased presence in the African continent. How do you think that this will change under Mr. Bolsonaro? Of course, Ambassador Graça Lima is the ideal person to answer this.
I don't know about that, Carlos. I'm not a specialist. I always consider myself a trade diplomat, and therefore I like to see developments under this other angle. But as far as South-South cooperation is concerned, it never was a first priority, even during the time when this cooperation was emphasized. It was more, again, as part of the party line, if you wish, but our ties with the traditional partners and also the new ones in Asia were always much stronger than those with Africa. I don't think, on the other hand, that it will change much. We still have our embassies in African countries. We have benefited from what has been achieved more in cultural terms than any other aspect via the CEBRI, the community of Lusophone countries, and we also have managed to expand our presence in some African countries through contracts that were made for the provision of services. And I don't think there will be any rupture there. Again, it's a question of what comes first and what comes next.
Okay. Winston, you want to add something?
Because of the South-South dimension, I was surprised by news yesterday that this government, which I thought that ideologically South-South would be out of bounds, is very keen on actually getting money from the BRICS Bank. You know, this new development bank created by the BRICS with Brazil, South Africa, China, India,
Russia.
They have no staff, this is very small, but there's this idea, bank, BRICS, bank. I mean, we don't like the World Bank, we'll do a new thing. It's called New Development. And there's now some Brazilian presidency rounds, and the government is giving, just because the bank is there's money, and the Brazilians are going to be the CEO in these rounds, it became important again. So Brazil is sending someone there. So this is something that, as I try to explain, realism, reality poses some opportunities and constraints that sometimes are taken. But it's South-South. This is a South-South idea, very unlike, the United States didn't like this bank, I think. So the alignment with the United States, Brazil gets a presidency of the BRIC Bank. Strange.
Okay, talking about strange things, next question.
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Christian Holland, and I work for Maersk, more specifically APM Terminals, so the trade policy part has a pretty natural interest for me at least. And I was wondering actually whether you at this point in time already have a view on what a potential US-China trade deal would mean for Brazil trade.
I can, yeah, sorry. People in agribusiness, they get kind of nervous when they think of the possibility that that trade will be diverted, trade in soybeans and you know, particularly in soybeans, maybe some other sectors, food stuff, because of an eventual agreement between China and the United States. But even in the United States, there's a very strong there's a very strong pressure on the USTR and President Trump himself not to close a deal that would only give more access to United States agricultural products. Besides that, I think there's room for everyone when it comes to trading in foodstuffs. What we need is really more open markets everywhere, even and particularly in China, and therefore the fact that the United States is eager to have more access is actually less important than to come to an understanding with China about 5G, about the real factors that create these tensions, that create this dispute. So again, if you have to, one gain from the bilateral visit to the United States that was never mentioned in the papers or by the media is that China was never mentioned, was never part of the agenda. And this is a great thing because people here were very much concerned about what Brazil could give up aligning with the United States and therefore getting apart from China, such an important trade partner and investor as well. And again, the best locus to deal with the China question or with the dispute is WTO. I know that it looks like a dream today to have a strengthened multilateral trading system, more open and more balanced, with the inclusion of all productive sectors. But this is what we should be aiming at, and this would solve not all problems, but a great deal of them.
Yeah, just to complement, in terms of the strength of Brazil-China relations, I'm very optimistic because as we discussed before, these are very complementary economies.
Right.
And not only Brazil needs China in terms of investments, manufactured goods, but China needs Brazil with respect to agriculture, okay? As I mentioned before, not today here, but Brazil and Argentina are the only two countries that can significantly expand their agricultural frontier and made a difference if you leave aside productivity gains in terms of agricultural production around the world. Nowadays, the Brazil-China relationship is very much a north-south type of relation, We basically export soybeans, iron ore, and oil. This is more or less 75 to 80% of our exports to China. And China mainly exports to Brazil manufactured products. But I think there is lots of potential for this to grow. But definitely, the relationship is affected by the broader, let's say, trade conflict that is going on, okay? One of the things that we know is that last year, when China retaliated against the steel and aluminum tariffs that the United States imposed on imports from almost everybody, including Brazil, China retaliated on soybeans. So if you look at the price of soybeans in the Gulf of Mexico, it came down significantly, and the price in Brazil and Argentina went up. Now, if there is a deal, probably we are going to see a reversal of this situation in the short term. But in the long term, this should be normalized. Okay?
Michael, I'm in finance in an agriculture company operating in Eastern Europe. If I'm looking at the agricultural environments, I've seen China going out and doing investments like they bought Smithfield in US, and actually large investments also in Eastern Europe. And they are focusing a lot on equity nowadays, as I see it. Would you see a kind of purchase of some of the big agri companies from Brazil by Chinese investors, and how would that be perceived by governments where focus is much more on society than it is in other regions?
Well, that's a tricky question. In Brazil, you still have.
Is your mic on?
I think so. That's what, no, I think it was on. It's off. It doesn't have any light here.
As we say, Brazil has a very liberal foreign direct investment policy. You can, there's no big restrictions. But in land, you still cannot own lands. You can control a property. In the frontier, in an area X kilometers from the frontier, you cannot full stop. But you cannot own the majority owner of land if you're a foreigner. Okay, it's complicated. Tricky ways to go around these things. Lawyers always have funny ideas, etc. But this may change. If that changes, when you open Brazilian agriculture for investments, but it has not yet changed. But I think it will. But this is it's an interesting issue, okay? Because obviously the frontier is just a piece of your land. So this may be a possibility. But today there's no restrictions on investment anywhere. In agriculture, there's restriction of our ownership of land, but that's about it. So the answer to your question is no, but they haven't yet started buying much except the infrastructure. They bought several electricity, transmission, and etc. companies. They're very strong on Brazilian electricity.
You want to add something?
Yeah, but I'm more kind of focused on if they can, like, if you take some of the big Brazilian companies, like in meat as an example,
Processing, yes.
Yeah, you could say Brazilian companies owning the land where they go in and buy, like, say, dominant positions in equity.
To buy equity in Petrobras. Simply, most of them are quoted in New York. You can buy them. This is for sale. You can buy a Brazilian beef processor without, except for global competition policy, etc. But Brazilian legislation, no problem.
It all depends of the regulatory implications, as Winston indicated. If, for instance, you are entering a sector where there will be concentration of power, but this would apply to anybody, okay? This may be an issue, but one of the things with respect to Chinese investments in agriculture, exactly because of the ownership of property restrictions by foreigners, they became much more invested in trading companies in Brazil, okay? But they are quite active here, okay? As they are in infrastructure. particularly electricity.
Hi, my name is Alejandro. I'm from Costa Rica. I work for Shell. My question is, given the resource base in oil and gas, what are the ambitions in petrochemicals and LNG, if any?
Right, that's a good question. In Petrobras' strategic plan released in December last year, there is an interest of Petrobras to be a part of the global gas market. And the reason why is that we foresee a lot of gas coming from the pre-salt, which means that we can, and that will depend on production. LNG is already a part of our, in the national system, the supply, important supply source for the gas in the country. But it can be possible that in the future we also become exporting Brazil. I mean, that's specific. It depends on the exploration and production that comes from the pre-salt. So it will increasingly be important to be connected to the international market of gas for all producers in Brazil.
Petrochemical?
And petrochemicals, that depends on how integrated the company wants to be. In the short term, what has been announced, given the debt is still very high, that we'll be looking for opportunities to diminish in the short term our participation in petrochemicals, as has already been announced. But in the long run, it depends on how integrated the company wants to be.
Very good.
I'll cue into.
Get a mic.
My name is Henrietta Ojiako, and I'm in oil and gas services, but I'm asking for human resources. The Chinese are noted for coming in with their workforce wherever they have business. Does the government of Brazil have any kind of limitations as to them importing workforce, especially at managerial levels?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I have a labor law since before the war. So that's the answer is yes. But I think the Chinese, they modulate things, and also they started in Africa, but they scrambled to Africa. And they scrambled Chinese way. They thought, well, you accept my unemployed guy, my convicts, whatever, send them in. But that's create problems in Africa. I don't think they're going to do that for much longer, even in countries with less restrictive labor law. In Brazil, it's all nine possible. No question about that. They know, but they never talked about that in Brazil. So what they're going to do is probably to export building, but I mean the construction workers that they may send will be very highly skilled, absolutely necessary. You have to get special permits in the foreign office and the labor office. It's quite complicated to get a foreign permit permanently in Brazil. But if it's in a project that you show that this kind of skill is very important, then you can get authorization. But not, I mean, unskilled labor force in Brazil is not the proposition.
Yeah.
Even in Africa today, I think countries are
Beginning to look into it.
Yeah, it has also decreased in other countries. In the case of Brazil, it's a known start. And the Chinese are very pragmatic. They know about it. I would even argue that Brazil needs to change. Because if you look, what is the participation of foreigners in the Brazilian labor force is less than 0.5% of the labor force, while in a country like the United States is around 12%, right? So our laws in terms, if you work for a multinational, of course, you get the visas and so on and so forth, but they are quite restrictive. Now, unskilled labor, there is no chance at all.
What happens in our sector is that we build our platforms in China, for example. So local workers are there, and then we bring the platform. And to operate the platform, we use nationals in Brazil, but the construction part is it's in China.
Winston?
Infrastructure, actually they can do that as well. They build things like a Lego. You know, Lego is children things. Sometimes they build huge pieces, sending barges, and assemble the whole piece on the spot. This is a way of exporting labor, but it's all discussed, except there's on the contract, that's how it's going to be done, but not sending people in Brazil to tighten the screws.
I didn't understand. Lego, the toy,
No, they build the equipment. You're building, let's say, a refinery. So
okay.
you have, heat transfer units with lots of things. They get into the barge, they build it there with
Right.
Chinese, Manchurian, then float it down, take it off, put on the piece.
Yeah, we just had the Agena. I'm sure you know about it. Yeah, they built it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was concerned for a moment if we had a new case of intellectual property problems with Denmark.
No, Lima was just the assembly.
Okay, similar, okay. Questions?
Is there a national risk component to this investment in pre-salt if oil would actually come down significantly again?
Good question. Brazil has had a stable, even though not attractive regulatory framework for the oil and gas sector over the last years. With the changes that has made in the past 3 years that I mentioned, many of them were by law, which gives some stability to the framework. Obviously, there are still room of improvement, but we don't see Brazil respects contracts. That's a tradition in the country. So it was a very stable framework, but not as attractive, and we are trying to change it to become more attractive. I don't see many risks of going backwards in that sense.
Well, last auctions, if we can give you an example, the Exxon, Shell, Total, you name it. I mean, this is the center of the frontier of the oil industry today. And the framework is quite big.
Yeah.
It's
There's still room for improvement. Yeah, with Shell and with other partners, always seems to go there. Still room for improvement, but it's a stable framework.
So, we are getting close to the end. Before I give back to our colleagues the opportunity for their closing remarks, any additional questions? No more, you are tired, I can see. Okay, remember, we have 8 hours this afternoon of seminars. Anyhow, let's start your closing remarks, Ambassador.
Thank you, and thank you again for being here, for listening to us, and for considering.
Is it on?
Considering the different points that were made, particularly regarding the theme at hand, how the Bolsonaro administration will conduct Brazilian foreign affairs. The answer to the question is we don't know yet. We have indications, we have signals. Some of them are quite controversial. If you listen only to the rhetorics, you will not find, perfect, will not come to a perfect conclusion. But you do have the prospect of advancing in terms of economic policy at home. Gladstone used to say, where's the quote from Gladstone? Sorry.
Do you want me to go into Google?
No, I have it here. I should have it here. Really sorry.
can paraphrase.
Yeah, I can't remember, I have the exact words. Here is my first principle of foreign policy, good government at home. And this is what we should be looking at. If you get things right at home, we will certainly have a consistent foreign policy.
Very good.
Well, that's a good moment to talk about oil and gas. I believe we are making the homework. I mean, we're doing the homework in the oil and gas sector. Speaking, the company has made huge improvements in the regulatory framework, and this is the reason why foreign companies are coming. And given the potential of the country, it's a mistake for training. So I don't see any risk of the country going into this in this regard.
Winston.
Yeah, I think I should agree with Gladstone. I mean, my point is more or less exactly that. That I mean, domestic policy eventually will take the fore in Brazil, and foreign economic policy is going to wait a little bit. Trade liberalization, the division of the Mercosur, etc., will take second level importance until 2020, 2012, after good policies at home are implemented. As for the diplomacy of economic policy, we still have to see. I don't think, as I underlined, that this automatic alignment with the United States is a good policy, and whether it's going to be implemented at all because of the contradictions I pointed out. This is to be seen. But trade liberalization, the reform of the domestic aspects of foreign economic policy waits for a little.
Yeah, all of these are very valid points. That's why you have this exam. 50% of you get a redo, so we'll have to come back next year to see if we had progress in terms of foreign affairs in Brazil and economic relations. But the bottom line, as several of the speakers pointed out, economic reality and, of course, the domestic situation, the political situation, will in the end determine a certain level of pragmatism with respect to Brazilian foreign policy. Some of you heard before the announcement, for instance, that Brazil was going to move its embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, already evolved in the direction of a commercial representation. And this, of course, reflected also the kind of reaction from Arab countries to whom we are very important exporters of meat, for example. With respect to the close alignment with the United States, it's also true that the president is planning a visit to China, and we'll see how this evolves. So I would like to thank you all for taking the time. Once again, thanks to CEBRI for helping organize this. There are two lessons that I learned in my life. One is that your jokes get funnier as you go up in the management chain. The second one is never do jokes in Korean. Because it's very hard to translate the English into Korean. I had a good friend, my boss, Danny Leipziger, who became famous because during the Asian crisis, he was the guy who negotiated, at that time, the largest World Bank loan to Korea. So he became a kind of hero in Korea. He would go often, and he likes a lot to tell jokes. And he would tell jokes, people would translate, nobody would laugh at him. He was very upset. One day he goes and he tells jokes during his presentation and everybody laughs. So when it ended, he went to a colleague, a Korean trained in the US, and said, wow, finally, you guys got a translator that was able to capture my jokes. And then his friend said, well, it was not exactly like that. What happened was every time that you told a joke, the translator would say, the American told a joke, let's laugh. So, with these words, once again, thanks for your attention and thanks for coming.
So our young students, lunch will be served 40 minutes in the same room as the breakfast. At 12:30, the lunch will be served in the room where we took